Our next speaker is David Henkin, who is professor of history at UC Berkeley. His scholarship and teaching covers baseball, Broadway, consumption, time, leisure, newspapers, world cities, and urban literature in the United States. Henkin has published books and essays also about street signs, paper money, junk mail, and intimate correspondence in the 19th century. He's the author of City Reading and the Postal Age, and together with Rebecca McLennan is currently working on a forthcoming Introduction to American History text. Dave.
Hi. One of the perils of going right after a fascinating talk like that is my mind is entirely up in space right now, but so again, thank you to all of you for coming, and also to the Institute for bringing me here, and for this wonderful institute. The enthusiasm, the very palpable enthusiasm that animates this institute and underwrites the collaborative scholarly ventures that we are envisioning in the name of things like big data, is interesting to me. I think that this enthusiasm partakes more generally of an attitude toward technology that is important to me as a historian, and I want to think with you about a little bit today. This is, I think, a kind of double optimism. First of all, it's an optimism about the potential of new technologies, of course, for gathering or retrieving or computing or visualizing data. The capacity of those new techniques for changing the kinds of questions that social scientists and even humanists, like the panelists you have before you right now, ask. And as a scholar, I'm keenly aware of that potential and of the transformative effect that it has on all of our work. It is, of course, impossible for me, as I imagine for any scholar of my generation, to imagine having produced the second project during the time period of the first project, just for no other reason than search techniques. But I think that this optimism that animates a launch like today is also is a theory of history. It's a theory that assumes, or maybe even proclaims, that new technologies, especially new technologies of inscription, communication, transportation, vision, define eras. That those technologies belong to a period of time, often a very specific and identifiable period of time, that they characterize that period, and they clearly demarcate ruptures between one moment of history and another. So that we're embracing the very manifest and manifold possibilities of new media or big data in part, not just because they are useful for us, but because we want to remain current in the most profound sense. We hope to avoid being left behind by history, and if the age we live in is the age of big data, then who would want to miss that party? I, as a historian, am aware of the appeal of this understanding of the era-defining power of the things that we call technology, not just because of who wants to miss that party, but because as historians and especially as teachers of history recognize, technological inventions and innovations provide our most powerful paradigms for what actually constitutes a revolution. New machines and new techniques are, among other things, highly seductive markers of moments of historical rupture, because as we imagine them, everyone, one day those machines and techniques do not exist. The next day, they exist supposedly for everyone. This is the revolutionary promise of technology to historians specifically. And this is the sort of promise that tempts historians to start talking about a revolution. So my charge today, as I see it as a cultural historian, of course, is to complicate, modulate that kind of revolutionary storyline, but not today in the dominant way that cultural historians of technology perform that task. Typically, and a tremendous example we just heard. Cultural historians of technology are very good at showing that technologies are not innocent, they're not autonomous, and they're not neutral. And they are not there are no shortcut to unraveling the complex processes by which one period morphs into another, or certainly no shortcut to understanding the workings of the technology itself. That's an important project, and as a teacher, I'm fully invested in that. But my own research actually has been devoted obliquely and perversely to the history of technology itself and to the kinds of social change associated with technology. I'm about to show you the kinds of things that I've worked on that Ellen hinted at in her introduction, and they might not seem, at first glance, like histories of technology. Set against the booming technological determinism that surrounds most of the history of communications, the communications devices that I have studied and I've written about are notably old school, or what I sometimes like to call technologically unspectacular. So urban texts, written and printed words that were posted, exhibited, and circulated in urban space, in this case in New York during the middle decades of the 19th century. Or the practices of sending, receiving, and expecting what we now somewhat condescendingly call snail mail. These represented technologically unspectacular innovations, I argue, in 19th century American life. And the books that I wrote about these two sets of practices sidestepped familiar technological narratives about their subjects, narratives about urban growth or reading and long-distance communication that featured things like steam printing presses or electric streetcars or steam locomotion or electromagnetism, any of those things, in order to tell very different kind of stories about habits and practices of social connection that relied upon machines and techniques that had been scientifically and commercially available centuries earlier. And that's an important distinction. It'd be very difficult to argue that the practices that I studied define their eras in the conventional sense in which we make those claims about technology, because, of course, people had been posting words on walls and sending written messages through intermediaries for millennia. Though in calling, for example, this book, The Postal Age, I was making the point that profound historical breaks in communications often come without flashy breakthroughs in the realm of what is technically possible. And it's the obsession with what is technically possible as a clue to moments of significant or profound rupture that I think have led many historians of technology and certainly many popular discussions of technological history astray. In both of those books, one might say that I try to show how new applications of old technologies played an underappreciated role in the formation of defining features of modernity, including the often cited annihilation of time and space associated with rail, travel, and telegraphy in the 19th century, or with new media in more recent times. But it might be just as accurate to label my subjects as new technologies themselves, rather than new applications of old ones. It's only if we persist in identifying technology with enabling scientific breakthroughs, a notion of technology that, by the way, makes the phrase new technology pretty redundant. Only if we continue to identify technology in that way does it seem odd to describe a new system of labeling streets or a new model of postal finance as an application of an old technology. Instead, it's probably more useful to understand technology simply something like this: a systematic use of human-made instruments to achieve goals or to solve perceived problems. And if you define it that way, then the scientific currency or the historical novelty or the commercial originality or creativity of the instrument itself, I think, seems secondary. And that is true, I think, for the period of my own scholarly expertise. In the 19th century in the United States, the crucial instruments and methods and systems of sociability came in a variety of forms. Some of them involved print or steam or electricity, but many did not. Things like optical telegraph relays, or mail stagecoaches, or networks of Methodist preachers, or national political parties, or credit reporting agencies. All those things rarely warrant attention in the history of 19th century technology, but they were among the most important and influential instruments for forging long-distance connections among a dispersed population. So historians interested in shifting experiences of contiguity or shifting notions of contemporaneity in that period, whether or not they call themselves historians of technology, attend to those instruments, even though, again, they fit uneasily into the model of technological history that privileges machines, innovations, and the sudden appearance of hitherto unknown techniques. Perhaps no field of historical inquiry, though, has been so dominated by the kind of narrow notion of technology or the kind of technological determinism that privileges devices and innovations as the study of the history of time consciousness, time discipline, or even temporal perception. Although temporal experience, as everyone knows, is of course shaped by things like ideas and religious traditions and highly subjective perceptions, historians have argued pretty forcefully for the central role of precise and standardized chronometry in altering the very meaning of time in the modern West. And this is the field in which I'm currently doing research. So the most obvious example, of course, of a chronometric device that's understood by historians to have had monumental impact and implication is the clock. And the development of clocks, the proliferation of clock ownership and watch ownership casts an enormous shadow over the field of the history of time. And even when chronometric devices themselves are not the subject, histories of time in the 19th century typically highlight innovative instruments or breakthrough technologies, things like intensified artificial illumination, or electromagnetic telegraphy, railroad travel photography, and we could add aerostation as well to the list. The list of innovative instruments, breakthrough techniques that alter perceptions of time. My own research into the history of time consciousness in the 19th century United States, though, focuses on another one of these unspectacular technologies. I'm interested in the unspectacular technology of the 7-day week. A timekeeping device that we all have in this room, I'm going to venture to say. We all feel we own, though perhaps it may be more accurate to say that it owns us. In shifting attention away from clock time to calendar time, I'm studying a time measure that is interesting because it has not undergone any obvious structural changes in recent centuries. In that sense, it would seem to resist the kinds of intervention historians are fond of making. Nor, for that matter, has its measurement been rendered any more precise by new time-keeping devices or by the technologies of steam or electromagnetism that famously annihilated time and space in the century that I write about it. Nonetheless, the 7-day week really is a remarkable technological device, created and preserved by elaborate human artifice. Weeks are completely and peculiarly independent of the observable natural cycles that mark or regulate the passage of days, months, and years. It is at core a very old technology. In fact, an ancient regime frequently invoked by traditional cultural critics as a bulwark against the encroachments of modern life. Most recently, Jonathan Crary's diatribe 24/7, some of you may have heard of, which bemoans the effects of perpetual accessibility and unremitting consumer participation, eloquently celebrates the week in these terms. But in fact, it's a common trope that somehow the week is an old timekeeping device that needs to continue to protect us from the incursion of things like capitalism or from other timekeeping technologies. Seen, of course, from a different perspective, the week is quintessentially modern. It's a rigid tracking device. It's indifferent to natural rhythms, like the ones that threaten the 24-hour day. and it's proven, in fact, especially congenial to market relations, to capitalist reorganization of labor, to demands of long-distance communication, and to the cultural logic or logics of impersonal society. The point that fascinates me is that the week has a rich and variegated history, despite its very long pedigree. The roots of, let's call it the modern American week, with its emphasis on a binary division between workdays and leisure days, lie, of course, in the spread of Christianity and its originally Jewish concept of a week culminating in a Sabbath. Weekly rhythms strengthened their hold over Western subjects in the 19th century, I'm arguing, and as many of you know, spread to all corners of the globe only in the late 20th century, only over the course of the 20th century. In the process, the week has become a far more comprehensive and pervasive framework for timekeeping. Far from simply being a bimodal cycle of work and rest, the modern week became a complex, differentiated regime, reinforced in countless arenas by countless institutions. Its rhythms are so thoroughly absorbed into popular experience that forgetting what day of the week it is constitutes a singular symptom of temporal disorientation. My guess is, if anyone were to suddenly be persuaded that today is not Friday, it would really rock your world. Apart from issues of monthly paychecks, not many of you are too invested in the question of whether today is April 30th or May 1st. But the modern temporal sensibility is so attached to the week that if you just think it's Tuesday, turns out to be Wednesday. It's like, whoa, right? You are somehow outside of time, or you were outside of time. In all kinds of fascinating ways that I won't detail here, modern Americans live by the week. But my research suggests that by many measures, most Americans had already become people of the week by the middle of the 19th century, but that for many of them, the change had taken place during the first, let's say, half, roughly, of that century. The evidence for the spread of the regime of the week in 19th century America comes from a vast array of sources, from newspapers, from religious tracts, liturgical manuals, school curricula, theater schedules, popular literature, menus, domesticity guides, marriage records, city directory, employee time logs, folklore, memoirs, and of course, diaries. Some of these sources are, in fact, illuminated by newly available search techniques and data analysis. I would say the search techniques have been extraordinarily helpful. I'm also helped by something that is not actually a new technology of search, but a peculiar feature of the English language, which is that the plural form of a word like Tuesday or Wednesday does actually track my interests. There are actually not that many languages where that's true, where if you say Tuesdays, right, you're already talking about a set of patterned behavior. So the word Tuesday is not a useful search term for me. The word Tuesdays is. But again, that's an idiosyncrasy of language. As French, I could say le mardi, and that might help, but it actually wouldn't be as useful. So yes, new techniques have helped, but of course all of those sources are illuminated by close reading, the kind of deep attention that was referred to in an earlier panel. These sources document a bunch of different things, including the following. First of all, the increasing use of the week to schedule and coordinate group activities in communities of strangers. One of the most powerful functions of the technology of the 7-day week. And again, not as a bimodal cycle of work and rest, but as a series of memorable, differentiated, regularly recurring days. Secondly, growing list of activities that took place or were normatively valued as taking place at weekly intervals. Right? A growth of that during the 19th century. Third, an intensifying differentiation of one weekday from another. And there was an increasing likelihood that an ordinary person's Tuesday would resemble her next Tuesday or previous Tuesday more closely than the Monday or Wednesday immediately following or preceding it. And consequently, the deepening attunement to what day it is. And finally, the emerging tendency to privilege the week as a unit of temporal introspection or retrospection. Right? What has happened over the past week? Or what am I going to accomplish this week? What is this week going to be like for me, for you, for us, for them? Right? All of these things, which are somewhat fuzzy and abstract, I'm trying to argue on the basis of the sources I mentioned earlier, actually developed over the course of the 19th century. The explanations for these developments are complex, as the kinds of technological changes that interest me often are. Broad forces like urbanization, which made the week increasingly useful for coordinating schedules, industrialization, which extended the implication of and the periodicity of certain kinds of work tasks, and compensation plans, and of course the spread of literacy and print, crucially newspapers and diaries, these two genres of literature that we call journals because of their relationship to the day, also both structured and advertised 7-day rhythms in public life and also registered and reinforced an awareness of individuals' positions within the weekly cycle. But these developments, urbanization, industrialization, the spread of literacy and print, don't fully account for the rise of the week as a temporal regime in 19th century America, in part because the week, of course, wasn't invented then and there. But once we stop emphasizing invention or introduction or proliferation or even application as the crucial things that happen to technologies, I think we can better appreciate the pervasive influence and structuring power of a technological instrument like the 7-day week, a chronometric technology that really did conquer the world in the 20th century and, interestingly, may be beginning to unravel in many societies in the 21st with things like asynchronous work and entertainment schedules or increasing communication and coordination among people who live in different time zones and therefore often different days of the week. So whether the week turns out to have been an era-defining technology for various periods of modern history remains, for me, an open question. It'll depend, of course, in part on changes in timekeeping and in temporal coordination that take place in the near and long-term future. But the power of the week remains a striking example of an unspectacular chronometric technology. I think it's hard to see that, both because it fits poorly into narratives of acceleration and accuracy, which are often the metrics by which we think of thresholds of technological change, but also because the week has become so imprinted onto our lives and in such visible ways that weekdays have actually come to seem like natural phenomena. And often when I point out to people that the week is independent of observable cycles, you can see people like running through their list of menstruation, lunation, of all the reasons why that might not be true, because does feel counterintuitive. The week does seem like a natural phenomenon, and weekdays do seem to have correlates in the observable universe. Interestingly, since we're on the subject of big data, chronobiologists have argued that the week does have a basis. If you can study certain forms of marine life through methods only available to us now because of computational power, we can see such things as circumseptan rhythms in the biological clocks that correspond roughly to something resembling 7 days, but are only observable to human beings through computers. So right. Yeah. So, but still, the week seems to be a natural phenomenon. Weekdays seem to be expressions of natural phenomena because of their power, and that is, of course, one of the hallmarks of a powerful technology. The technology strikes us in rooms like this because it announces itself. The real power of that technology, and the example of aerostation, aerial vision, is such a perfect illustration of it. The real power of that technology is marked not by the moment where people stop and say, what am I looking at? By the moment where they stop asking that question at all and think that it simply corresponds with nature as it is given. thank you for your time, and I look forward to the third presentation.